Hello everyone! After almost 6 years since Genshin's release, we are finally heading into the main area of Snezhnaya. With all new regions, there are a ton of new game mechanics and characters to play as usual. But also, in version 7.0, there will be 5 new craftable weapons, 5 new battle pass weapons, 2 new signature weapons, and 2 new artifact sets available to use for your teams, especially for the new stellar related teams. So I wanted to go over all the new Snezhnaya weapons and artifacts, explaining how they work, who can use them the best, and how strong they look to be, including various pre-release calcs from different Theorycrafters. Before we go over all the gear, one important thing to note is that many of the new Snezhnaya weapons and artifacts revolve around stellar reactions, the key new mechanic of the region. In version 7.0, there will be 2 types of stellar reactions, stellar conduct, which is cryo plus electro, and stellar swirl, which is cryo plus anemo. For the purposes of this video, you don't need to know exactly what they do, but what you should know is that, at least in 7.0, your team can trigger these new stellar reactions when you have either Snezhnaya, Odette, or the Cryo Traveler on your team. More characters that enable the stellar reactions are likely to be added in the future, and you trigger stellar conduct by applying cryo and then electro, or vice versa, and you trigger stellar swirl by applying anemo onto an enemy that already has cryo. Now, in the description of many of the new weapons, artifacts, and even character kits, they may refer to something called a stellar glimmer reaction. This is not a special third stellar reaction. Stellar glimmer is just a generic term that refers to any stellar reaction. So as of now, stellar glimmer just means stellar conduct and stellar swirl. Now, let's talk about the 5 new Snezhnaya craftable weapons. 4 out of the 5 weapons have the same type of passive, so if you understand how one works, you'll understand the rest. First, we have the new craftable sword, Emberwell. 510 base attack, 165 elemental mastery substat. For the passive, when the holder triggers any elemental reaction, they will get an attack buff for 12 seconds. Now, if they trigger a stellar reaction, on top of the attack buff, they will also get a stellar damage buff for 12 seconds. This sword can be a decent option even outside of stellar related teams for characters that can benefit from EM and attack, and who trigger reactions. Some that come into mind are Kaching, Alhaitham, and Cloran in Dendro related teams, and also Durin in teams where he's the one triggering reactions like Forward Vaporize. Other weapons are probably going to be similar or better though, as this new craftable sword is mainly good in stellar teams for the extra stellar damage bonus. The one main character who can utilize this sword in 7.0 is Odette. This weapon is good for her, but it heavily depends on the team she's in, because the passive only activates when she triggers a stellar reaction. It doesn't activate if she deals direct stellar damage onto an enemy. Thus, Odette cannot activate the weapon's passive in stellar swirl teams because due to how the anemo element works, only anemo characters can trigger stellar swirl. And in stellar conduct teams, uptime of the passive depends on how many electro characters are on the team. If the team has one electro off-fielder like Yai, and you have a cryo on-fielder, Odette can trigger the reaction once in a rotation because she generally goes after Yai, so the enemy will have electro to allow her to trigger stellar conduct when she uses her double skill and applies cryo. But after that, since there's so much cryo being applied with a cryo on-fielder, Odette won't be able to trigger stellar conduct again until the next rotation. As a result, in these teams, she generally will get 12 seconds of uptime on the passive. But in teams with 2 electro characters, whether it is 2 electro off-fielders or 1 electro off-fielder and 1 electro on-fielder, she will be able to trigger stellar conduct while off-field, so the weapon passive will get full uptime on her. Based on weapon calcs done by Theorycrafter Temeyaro for Odette in a triple cryo Snezhnaya team, R5 Emberwell is similar to R5 Finale of the Deep, even with just 12 seconds of uptime on its passive. With double electro, the weapon will get full uptime on its passive, so it will get a little stronger. And in stellar swirl teams, the sword's passive gets no uptime at all, so it will get worse. So the new craftable sword can be one of Odette's best 4-star free-to-play swords, but its effectiveness depends on the team. Second, we have the new craftable claymore, Blade of Atonement. 565 base attack, 27.6% attack substat, with a similar passive. When the holder triggers any elemental reaction, they will get an elemental mastery buff for 12 seconds. If they trigger a stellar reaction, on top of the EM buff, they will also get an attack buff for 12 seconds. A character like Malwika can technically use this weapon outside of stellar teams since it gives attack and EM, though other weapon options will likely be better. The main value will be for stellar teams, and the one stellar claymore main DPS user we have at the moment is Snezhnaya. But again, because the passive requires her to trigger a stellar reaction, how good the new claymore will be depends on the team. In stellar swirl teams, Snezhnaya can't trigger stellar swirl because she's cryo, not anemo, so the weapon's passive isn't enabled and the weapon won't be that good. In stellar conduct teams, if you have double electro, such as Yai plus either Alosha or Beidou, Snezhnaya should be able to trigger the passive at the start of her field time. This might be inconsistent in practice, but if it does work, the weapon will be pretty good, becoming her best 4-star free-to-play option. However, if you're playing Snezhnaya in a team with only 1 electro off-fielder, she won't be able to trigger stellar conduct and this weapon's passive won't work, so it won't be that good for her. So the new craftable claymore can be good for Snezhnaya, but again, it depends on the team. Third, we have the new craftable polearm, Song of the Vigil. 565 base attack, 110 elemental mastery substat with the same passive requirement. When the holder triggers any elemental reaction, they will get energy. If they trigger a stellar reaction, on top of the energy, they will also get an additional attack buff for 12 seconds. Like the other craftable weapons, Song of the Vigil's main value will be for stellar related teams. In 7.0, the one main polearm DPS in stellar teams is Cyno. However, he is not a great user of this weapon because of the passive's requirement requiring him to trigger stellar conduct. He can do this consistently if he's the only electro character on the team, but these teams don't really exist. You want at least one other electro character for extra electro particles so Cyno can burst, especially Yai who does a ton of damage. And with double electro, Cyno won't be able to consistently activate the passive, so he's still going to prefer using previous weapon options as shown by this weapon calc done by Theorycrafter raulfigas. So this weapon may be intended for a future character that has yet to be released. Fourth, we have the new craftable catalyst, Echoes of the Heart. 565 base attack, 27.6% attack substat, and same type of passive as the other craftables. When the holder triggers any elemental reaction, they will get an elemental mastery buff for 12 seconds. If they trigger a stellar reaction, on top of the EM buff, they will also get a stellar damage buff for 12 seconds. The main user of this weapon in 7.0 will be Yai in stellar conduct teams. If she is the only electro character on the team, which is a common team setup for Sandrone and Wriothesley, she'll get full uptime on the passive, and it will be her new best 4-star weapon option in stellar conduct teams. If there's another electro character on the team, Yai can still technically get at least 12 seconds of uptime if you change the rotation to ensure that Cryo is on the enemy before Yai takes the field. For example, doing Odette into Yai instead of the standard Yai into Odette, but the decreased uptime means it will be less effective. Wriothesley can also use the new craftable catalyst, but this can only be possible in double electro teams, the main one being Yai plus Beidou, since with double electro, there can be enough electro so that Wriothesley's Cryo can trigger stellar conduct to activate the passive, though even in this scenario, it may still be inconsistent in practice. Most of Wriothesley's stellar conduct teams only have one electro character, and with less electro, Wriothesley can't trigger stellar conduct with his Cryo, so in most cases, the new craftable catalyst won't be a good choice for him. Finally, the fifth new craftable weapon, the bow, Covenant of Frost and Snow. This is the one craftable weapon with a passive different than the other four. 510 base attack, 51.7% defense substat, and the passive simply gives elemental mastery for 12 seconds after the holder uses their skill. This new bow is pretty much made for specifically Linnea since she scales with defense and elemental mastery, and it will be her new best free-to-play weapon option, being better than her previous free-to-play bow option, Slingshot. So overall, the new craftable weapons can be quite good in the right scenarios, but being in the right scenarios is very important, as because 4 out of the 5 weapon passives requires the holder to trigger an elemental reaction, the team composition you're playing heavily determines the weapon's effectiveness on a character. Also, with a bunch of new Snezhnaya characters lined up to be released in the future, the craftable weapons are likely to see more users later down the line. With the craftables out of the way, let's go over the 5 new Battle Pass weapons that are being added with version 7.0, starting with the sword, Heretic's Molten Blade, 510 base attack, 27.6% crit rate substat, and with the passive, when the holder uses their elemental skill, for 14 seconds they will get an attack buff scaling with the amount of movement they do in a similar way to how Eonsun's buff scales. Because of its unique movement dependent passive, the sword looks very niche at the moment. The one character I can see taking advantage of it currently is Cloran, since she dashes with every enhanced skill she uses. Unfortunately, because her overload teams give a lot of attack buffs already, the large attack buff the Battle Pass sword gives isn't as valuable. The weapon will still be fine on her, being comparable to Calamity of Ashu and getting better with higher refinements. I do think it's likely that a future character will synergize better with this weapon. My personal guess for this character would be Vesna. Second, we have the new Battle Pass Claymore, Forged by the Golden Melody, 510 base attack, 27.6% crit rate substat, and its passive is quite unique. Every 10 seconds, the holder will get a cycling damage buff. The first 10 seconds, they'll get an attack buff, and after that, for the next 10 seconds, they'll get an elemental mastery buff, and then after that, they'll get a stellar damage buff for 10 seconds. Then it will cycle back to the attack buff and continue going in that order. Now if the holder triggers a stellar reaction, they will get an additional damage buff matching the buff cycle that they were in for 12 seconds. So for example, if the character currently is in the 10-second attack buff duration and they trigger a stellar reaction, they will get another attack buff for 12 seconds, stacking with the original. Keep in mind that because of the different buff durations and requirement of triggering a stellar stellar reaction, there will be times where you'll have 2 of the same buffs which stack, and times where you have different damage buffs active at the same time. Since the passive gives stellar damage bonus, and its extra effect requires triggering a stellar reaction, the main user of the Battle Pass Claymore in 7.0 will be Snezhnaya. But just like the new craftable Claymore, Forged by the Golden Melody's effectiveness depends on her team because the extra buff requires her to trigger a stellar reaction. In stellar conduct teams with 2 Electro offielders, though it can be inconsistent, Snezhnaya can trigger stellar conduct, and if it works well in practice, the Battle Pass Claymore is very good, being fine at R1 and one of her best overall weapons at R5. However, in teams where she can't trigger a stellar reaction, such as stellar conduct teams with only 1 Electro offfielder or stellar swirl teams, Snezhnaya will only get the 10-second cycling damage buff. In this case, it's still a decent option with refinements, but won't be as strong as her better 5-star stat sticks. Third, we have the new Battle Pass Polearm, Frost Breath, 510 base attack, 45.9% energy recharge substat, and for its passive, after the holder triggers a cryo or hydro related reaction, they will get an attack buff for 15 seconds and restore a flat amount of energy for the other characters in the party, and this has a 16-second cooldown. Functionally, this weapon serves the same role as Favonius Lance, give energy for the party. Because of the reaction requirement, the Battle Pass Polearm is not as flexible or versatile of a support weapon as Favonius Lance, making it, in my opinion, generally worse than Favonius Lance. However, in scenarios where Favonius Lance doesn't work, such as when you're attacking enemy shields and can't crit the enemy to proc the Favonius passive, the Battle Pass Polearm will be better. Any support characters who can trigger a cryo or hydro related reaction can use this. The most recent character example for this is Alosha, since stellar conduct is a cryo related reaction and his kit scales with attack and energy recharge. Fourth, the new Battle Pass Catalyst, Clash of Kings, 510 base attack, 27.6% crit rate substat. Its passive, after the holder uses their elemental skill, they will get an attack and EM buff for 6 seconds. If the holder hits an enemy with a charge attack, the buff duration is extended for another 6 seconds. So the weapon is good for Catalyst DPSs that use their charge attack and ideally want attack and EM. Some that come to mind include Yanfei, Klee, and Mona in Vape teams, where they are the ones primarily triggering the reactions, and Wriothesley Reverse Melt teams where he triggers melts. In these types of teams, Clash of Kings should be a solid 4-star weapon option. Nefer can also technically use the new Battle Pass Catalyst. The attack is useless, but the EM buff is good and the weapon gives crit rate. Assuming R5 of the new Battle Pass Catalyst, the Nodcry Craftable gives 21 more EM and 48 lunar damage percent instead of the 27.6% crit rate, and R5 Dawning Frost gives 40 more EM while having a similar crit value, but gives crit damage instead of crit rate. So Clash of Kings can be competitive or better than Nefer's existing best 4-star weapon options, but it has 2 big caveats. First, the new Battle Pass Catalyst gives crit rate, and Nefer gets a lot of crit rate already from Lalma and the Nodcry DPS set, so it will be more difficult to get a proper build that accommodates for Clash of Kings. And second, refinements matter a lot to increase the EM buff, and personally, I don't think it's worth spending money on 5 battle passes to R5 this weapon just to put it on Nefer. You can honestly stick to R5 at the Nodcry Craftable and save money. Lastly, while Reverse Melt Wriothesley can take full advantage of Clash of Kings passive buff, Stellar Conduct Wriothesley, which is his main best team archetype, can't benefit fully from the new Battle Pass Catalyst. This is because the extra 6-second duration relies on hitting an enemy with a charged attack, but in Stellar Conduct teams, Wriothesley's enhanced charge attack deals direct Stellar Conduct damage, which doesn't count as a regular charge attack hit, meaning he can only get 6 seconds of the attack and EM buff from Clash of Kings, not the full 12-second buff duration. Wriothesley can still technically do a regular charge attack to get the full buff, but that comes with the downside of extending his rotation, lowering his effective DPS. Consequently, the new Battle Pass Catalyst is alright for Stellar Conduct Wriothesley, but even at R5, it isn't that amazing. The fifth and final new Battle Pass weapon is the bow, Jade Vista. 510 base attack, 27.6% crit rate substat, and the passive gives the holder additional elemental mastery based on the number of teammates who is the same element as the holder, and additional attack based on the number of teammates who is a different element compared to the holder. As a generic DPS bow, this weapon is actually pretty good since many characters can benefit from crit rate, attack, and or EM. Looking at the current bow users, a good chunk of them should be able to benefit from Jade Vista, making it probably the best Battle Pass bow out of the 3. To give one example, Linnea can make good use of Jade Vista because her teams are generally triple geo, so she gets a lot of EM from the passive, as well as appreciating the crit rate, and is looking to be her new best 4-star weapon option for damage. Overall, the new Battle Pass weapons can be great pickups if you have the specific characters that can utilize them the best. I wouldn't call any of them insanely strong, so don't feel pressured to buy the Battle Pass, but if you have the characters that can benefit the most from them, in teams that allow them to do so, you can consider getting them and potentially getting them to R5. And just like for the new craftables, it is likely that future new Snezhnaya characters will be good users of some of the new Battle Pass weapons. On top of the new craftable and battle pass weapons, in 7.0 there will be 2 new signature weapons, one for Odette and one for the Traveler. I will cover them more in depth in the separate Odette and Cryo Traveler guides, but just to briefly talk about them here, Odette's signature mainly just improves her personal DPS, but she generally isn't the majority of the team's damage, so it isn't that strong of a weapon in terms of team damage increase, and you would rather pull her constellations. And the Traveler signature is incredible because you get it and its refinements for free by playing through Snezhnaya. It gives a ton of extra stats for the Traveler with its passive, and you can still use it on any sword character in the game as a solid stat stick. Lastly, let's go over the 2 new artifact sets also releasing in 7.0. First, we have Heart at the Furnace, which is the generic stellar support set. 2-piece gives 18% attack, and the 4-piece gives 12% more attack, and the entire team 50% stellar damage bonus for 12 seconds when the holder either triggers a stellar reaction or deals direct stellar reaction damage with their abilities. The 4-piece gives a very strong stellar damage team buff, so every team with a stellar DPS should have a support holding this set. There will likely be more characters that can hold this set in the future, but at least in 7.0, the best general holder of 4-piece furnace will be Odette. She does off-field stellar damage with her abilities, so she can easily maintain full uptime of the stellar damage buff in any team she's in. Now if you don't have Odette or aren't using her and you're using Cryo Traveler as kind of her replacement, then they can use the set as well, since they also deal direct stellar damage with their enhanced charge attack and burst. But because only these 2 abilities deal direct stellar damage and they can't do it off-field like Odette can, Cryo Traveler can only consistently get 12 seconds of buff uptime from 4-piece furnace once they swap out after using their enhanced charge attack and burst when they swap in. If you're not using Odette or Cryo Traveler, then electro characters like Yai, Alosha, and C6 Beidou can use it in Stellar Conduct teams with the Cryo Stellar Conduct main DPS, and Cryo characters like Chi-Chi can use it with an Electro Stellar Conduct main DPS. Just remember that characters like Alosha, C6 Beidou, and non-C6 Chi-Chi don't deal direct Stellar Conduct damage, so they will have to rely on triggering Stellar Conduct to proc 4-piece furnace. The second new artifact set in 7.0 is Scarlet Proof. 2-piece gives 18% attack, and the 4-piece gives the holder 16% crit rate and 40% stellar swirl damage bonus for 10 seconds after they trigger a stellar swirl reaction while on field. This is the stellar swirl DPS set. However, the 4-piece only activates when the holder triggers a stellar swirl reaction. Direct stellar swirl damage from character abilities will not activate the set. Cryo characters like Sandrone and Cryo Traveler, who can deal direct stellar swirl damage with their abilities in stellar swirl teams, cannot use this set. Since only a Cryo aura can be on an enemy and not Anemo, only Anemo characters can trigger Stellar Swirl. Thus, 4-piece Scarlet Proof can only be used on Anemo Stellar Swirl DPSs. In 7.0, the one main user of this set will be Mizuki, who is getting new buffs that allow her to deal Stellar Swirl damage with her abilities. This set is fine on Mizuki, but because she doesn't scale with attack but mainly with Elemental Mastery, she doesn't take full advantage of Scarlet Proof, making it not her clear best artifact set choice. It is comparable to her other set choices, especially when looking at her personal damage, but for team damage, the most optimal set for Mizuki is looking to be 4-piece Viridescent Venerer, which is getting buffed to incorporate the Stellar Swirl reaction. So in 7.0, Scarlet Proof won't have a clear best user of it, but when a new attack scaling Anemo Swirl DPS releases, which is most likely going to be Vesna, the set will be best in slot for them. That is everything I wanted to cover about the new weapons and artifacts releasing in Genshin version 7.0. Big thanks to Theorycrafters Temeyaro and raulfigas for allowing me to cite their calcs in this video. Their hard work and help were essential in making this video possible, so huge shout out to them. Their socials are linked in the description below. If you found this video guide helpful, consider liking and sharing the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on similar guide videos in the future. Leave any questions you have in the comments, and with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day.